The Texas sun began to set over San Antonio, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected off the downtown skyscraper's windows. George Strait adjusted his cowboy hat as he walked through the busy streets, trying to blend in among the pedestrians. At 72, the king of country still maintained the elegant bearing that made him a legend, but he preferred moments like this, away from the spotlight, just a common man watching life unfold. It was Thursday, late March 2025, and George had just left a meeting with his production team downtown. His upcoming farewell tour was generating enormous buzz across the country, and every detail needed to be perfect. The meeting had run longer than expected, and now he found himself walking through the historic district as the city began to wind down from another busy day. The familiar sounds of San Antonio filled the air, distant mariachi music from the River Walk, the hum of traffic, and the chatter of tourists exploring the Alamo area. George had walked these streets countless times throughout his life, but tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the weight of knowing this tour would truly be his last, or perhaps it was simply the melancholy that comes with age and reflection. As he turned onto Commerce Street, heading toward where his driver was waiting, George's attention was caught by a figure huddled near the entrance of an old building. The man sat on a piece of cardboard, his back against the brick wall, wearing a tattered military jacket that had seen better days. A worn baseball cap covered most of his face, and a small cup sat in front of him with a few coins scattered inside. George had seen many homeless veterans in his travels across the country, and it always broke his heart. These men and women had served their country with honor, only to return to a society that often forgot their sacrifices. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a $20 bill, and approached the man. "God bless you, sir," George said softly, leaning down to place the money in the cup. The man looked up, and George felt his breath catch in his throat. Despite the weathered face, the graying beard, and the hollow eyes, he recognized those features immediately. It was like looking at a ghost from his past. "Jimmy? Jimmy Martinez?" George whispered, his voice barely audible above the street noise. The man's eyes widened in recognition, and for a moment neither of them moved. Jimmy Martinez had been George's closest friend during their time in the Army, stationed together at Fort Sam Houston in the early 1970s. They had been young men then, full of dreams and ambitions, sharing stories about their plans for the future during long nights on guard duty. George Strait!" Jimmy's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Is that really you?" George immediately knelt down beside his old friend, ignoring the curious stares of passing pedestrians. "Jimmy, what happened to you? How did you end up here?" Jimmy's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to find words. "It's a long story, George. A real long story." He looked down at his hands, weathered and dirty from life on the streets. "I never thought I'd see you again, especially not like this." The two men sat in silence for a moment, both processing the surreal nature of their reunion. George's mind raced back to their Army days. Jimmy had been the one with the quick wit and infectious laugh, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood during difficult times. He had been a skilled mechanic and had plans to open his own auto repair shop when he got out of the service. "Listen, Jimmy," George said, his voice firm but gentle. "You can't stay out here. Come with me." Jimmy shook his head. "I can't, George. You don't understand. I'm not the same person you knew back then. I've made mistakes, done things I'm not proud of. I don't want to be a burden to anyone, especially not to you." George placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You were never a burden, Jimmy. Not then, not now. We're brothers, remember? We looked out for each other in the Army, and that hasn't changed." The emotion in George's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just a celebrity doing a good deed. This was a man who had found a piece of his past that he thought was lost forever. The bond forged in military service ran deeper than fame or fortune. "I don't know, George," Jimmy said, his voice breaking. "I've been living like this for 3 years now. I'm not sure I remember how to be around normal people anymore." "Then we'll figure it out together," George replied without hesitation. "But first, let's get you somewhere warm and get some food in you." As George helped Jimmy to his feet, he noticed other homeless individuals watching from nearby doorways and alleys. San Antonio, like many American cities, had a significant homeless population, and many of them were veterans who had fallen through the cracks of an overburdened system. Jimmy gathered his few possessions, a small backpack, a worn blanket, and a water bottle, and followed George to where his driver was waiting. The driver, a middle-aged man named Carlos, who had worked for George for years, didn't bat an eye when his boss approached with the homeless veteran. "Carlos, this is my friend Jimmy," George said simply. "We're going to make sure that no veteran in San Antonio has to sleep on the streets," the mayor declared at a press conference. "George Strait and Jimmy Martinez have shown us what's possible when we come together as a community." Jimmy found himself thrust into a role he never could have imagined, speaking at community events, sharing his story at churches and civic organizations, and helping to develop programs for other veterans in recovery. The attention was overwhelming at times, but he drew strength from the knowledge that his experience was helping others. One evening, as they returned from a particularly successful fundraising event that had raised over $50,000 for veteran services, Jimmy's phone rang again. This time it was Sophia. "Dad?" Her voice was softer than Miguel's had been, more hesitant. "Sophia, sweetheart," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you called. Miguel told me about your meeting. He said you were different, that you seemed healthy and happy." She paused. "I saw you on the news. I'm proud of what you're doing to help other people." They talked for over an hour, with Sophia sharing details about her nursing career and her plans for the future. She was more cautious than Miguel had been, but Jimmy could hear the love in her voice, despite the years of separation. "I'd like to see you," she said finally, "but I need time to process all of this. It's been a long time, Dad." "Take all the time you need," Jimmy assured her. "I'm not going anywhere. Not." As summer turned to fall, the Veteran Assistance Program that had grown out of George and Jimmy's friendship continued to expand. The Healing Hearts Recovery Center opened a second location specifically for veterans, funded entirely by community donations. Local employers had created over 100 jobs specifically for veterans in recovery, and the city had opened its first transitional housing facility for homeless veterans. George's farewell tour was scheduled to begin in January, but he found himself thinking more about this new mission than his music career. One evening, as he and Jimmy sat on the porch watching the sunset, he shared his thoughts. "You know, Jimmy, I've been thinking about what comes after the tour ends. I've got more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, but this work we're doing feels more important than anything I've ever done." Jimmy nodded. "It's given me a purpose I never thought I'd have again. Helping these guys, seeing them get their lives back together. It's better than any job I ever had." "What would you think about making this a permanent thing?" George asked. "Setting up a foundation, maybe buying some property where we could create a comprehensive program for veterans, housing, job training, counseling, the whole package." Jimmy's eyes lit up. "You mean like a campus where veterans could come to get the help they need?" "Exactly. We could call it the Second Chance Ranch or something like that. A place where veterans could rebuild their lives with dignity." The idea began to take shape over the following weeks. George consulted with financial advisors, architects, and program experts to develop a comprehensive plan for what would become the largest veteran assistance facility in Texas. The next morning, George woke up early and found Jimmy already awake, sitting on the back porch watching the sunrise over the pastures. The sight of his old friend in clean clothes, his beard trimmed and his hair washed, was a stark reminder of the transformation that was possible with just basic care and dignity. "Beautiful morning," Jimmy said as George joined him with 2 cups of coffee. "Every morning is beautiful when you've got a roof over your head and people who care about you," George replied, settling into the chair beside his friend. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both men processing the events of the previous day. Finally, George spoke up. "Jimmy, I want to be straight with you about something. I can give you a place to stay and help you get back on your feet, but the real work has to come from you. Are you ready to get sober?" Jimmy turned to face his friend, his eyes clear and determined. "I haven't had a drink in 6 months, George. Living on the streets, I couldn't afford it anymore. But I know that's not the same as being in recovery. I need real help." George nodded, impressed by his friend's honesty. "I've got connections at a treatment center here in San Antonio. It's not like the VA system. It's smaller, more personal. Would you be willing to go?" "If you think it's the right thing to do, then yes," Jimmy replied. "I trust you, George. You're the first person in years who's looked at me like I'm still human." That afternoon, George drove Jimmy to the Healing Hearts Recovery Center, a private facility that specialized in treating veterans with substance abuse issues. The director, Dr. Sarah Chen, was a friend of George's who had worked extensively with military personnel. "Mr. Martinez has been through a lot," Dr. Chen explained after interviewing Jimmy. "But he's in better shape than many of the veterans we see. The fact that he's been sober for 6 months is encouraging. We can work with him on an outpatient basis, which means he can continue staying with you if that's what you both want." George was relieved. He had been worried that Jimmy would need to be institutionalized, which might have made him feel like he was being abandoned again. This way, they could work together on his recovery. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Jimmy would attend group therapy sessions 3 times a week, see a counselor individually twice a week, and participate in job training programs at the center. In between, he helped George around the ranch, tending to the cattle and maintaining the property. The physical work was therapeutic for Jimmy, giving him a sense of purpose and accomplishment. George was amazed at how quickly his friend's mechanical skills returned. Jimmy fixed everything from broken fence posts to the engine on George's old pickup truck. "You haven't lost your touch," George observed one afternoon, as Jimmy successfully repaired a stubborn tractor. "Some things you never forget," Jimmy replied with a smile, the first genuine smile George had seen from him since their reunion. As Jimmy's physical and mental health improved, George began to learn more about the circumstances that had led to his friend's homelessness. The story was more complex than simple addiction and PTSD, though those factors certainly played a role. Jimmy had actually been successful for many years after leaving the army. He had opened his auto repair shop as planned and had built a good life for himself and his family. But in the early 2000s, a series of unfortunate events had begun his downward spiral. First, his shop had been burglarized, and without adequate insurance, he had lost most of his tools and equipment. Then his wife Maria had been diagnosed with breast cancer, requiring expensive treatments that their insurance only partially covered. As the medical bills mounted and his business struggled to recover, Jimmy had turned to alcohol to cope with the stress. "I started drinking to forget about our problems," Jimmy explained during one of their evening talks. "But the drinking just made everything worse. I became unreliable, lost customers, and couldn't provide for my family when they needed me most." Maria had fought her cancer bravely, but the combination of her illness and Jimmy's drinking had put an unbearable strain on their marriage. After she recovered, she had given him an ultimatum: get sober or lose his family. "I chose the bottle," Jimmy said, his voice thick with regret. "I was too proud to admit I needed help, and I convinced myself that they were better off without me. So I left." For several years, Jimmy had drifted from job to job, city to city, always moving when his drinking became too much of a problem. Eventually, he had ended up in San Antonio, where he had been living on the streets for the past 3 years. "Have you tried to contact Maria and the kids?" George asked gently. Jimmy shook his head. "I've wanted to, but I'm afraid. What if they don't want to see me? What if I've hurt them too much?" George could understand his friend's fear, but he also knew that healing often required facing the pain of the past. "Maybe it's time to find out," he suggested. "You're not the same person who left them. You're getting help, you're sober, and you're trying to rebuild your life." The suggestion planted a seed in Jimmy's mind, though he wasn't ready to act on it immediately. Instead, he threw himself into his recovery program and his work around the ranch. Dr. Chen was impressed with Jimmy's progress. "He's one of the most motivated patients I've worked with," she told George during a family meeting. "His trauma runs deep, but he's doing the work to heal. The key now is helping him rebuild his sense of self-worth and purpose." George had been thinking about that very issue. Jimmy was clearly talented and capable, but he needed more than just temporary refuge. He needed a path forward, a way to contribute to society and regain his dignity. The answer came to George during a conversation with his ranch manager, Tom Wilson. Tom was approaching retirement and had been looking for someone to help with the day-to-day operations of the ranch. "You know, George," Tom said, "that friend of yours has a real gift with machinery. He's fixed more things around here in the past month than I've been able to get to in 6 months. If he's looking for steady work, I could use the help." George discussed the idea with Jimmy, who was both excited and nervous about the prospect of full-time employment. "I haven't had a steady job in years," Jimmy admitted. "What if I mess it up?" "You won't," George said confidently. "You've got the skills, and more importantly, you've got the drive. Tom wouldn't have suggested it if he didn't think you could handle it." Jimmy accepted the position as assistant ranch manager, a role that would give him a steady income, health insurance, and a sense of purpose. The work was challenging but rewarding, and it allowed him to use both his mechanical skills and his natural leadership abilities. As summer approached, Jimmy had been sober for 9 months and had been living at the ranch for 3. His transformation was remarkable. He had gained weight, his eyes were clear and bright, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had found his way back to himself. George watched this transformation with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had helped save his friend's life, but in many ways, Jimmy had saved something in George as well. The experience had reminded him of the importance of loyalty, friendship, and using his success to make a real difference in the world. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jimmy brought up the subject that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. "George, I think I'm ready to try to find Maria and the kids," he said quietly. "I know I may not get the response I'm hoping for, but I need to try. I need to make amends for what I put them through." George nodded, proud of his friend's courage. "I'll help you however I can. Do you know where they might be?" Jimmy pulled out a worn piece of paper from his wallet. "I kept their last known address. It's here in San Antonio. I used to drive by the house sometimes, but I never had the courage to knock on the door. We'll go together," George said. "You don't have to face this alone." As they made plans to reach out to Jimmy's family, neither man could have imagined how their reunion would soon capture the attention of the entire city and inspire a movement that would change countless lives. The next Saturday morning, George and Jimmy drove through the familiar streets of San Antonio's west side, heading toward the address Jimmy had carried in his wallet for years. The neighborhood was a mixture of modest homes and small businesses, predominantly Latino, with the sounds of children playing and families going about their weekend routines. Jimmy's hands trembled slightly as they approached the street where his family had lived. "What if they've moved?" he asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. "Then we'll find them," George replied simply. "One step at a time." As they turned onto Guadalupe Street, Jimmy pointed to a small yellow house with a well-maintained yard. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's where they were living when I left. George parked across the street, and they sat in the truck for a moment, both men gathering their thoughts. The house looked peaceful, with children's toys scattered in the front yard and a small garden growing along the fence line. "I don't know if I can do this," Jimmy said, his courage wavering. "You can," George said firmly. "But if you want to wait, we can come back another time. There's no rush." Jimmy took a deep breath and shook his head. "No, I need to do this now. I've waited too long already." As they approached the front door, Jimmy's steps became slower and more hesitant. George stayed close beside him, offering silent support. Jimmy raised his hand to knock, then hesitated again. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her early 60s with graying hair and kind eyes. She was carrying a laundry basket and stopped short when she saw the two men standing on her porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious but polite. Jimmy removed his hat and looked directly at her. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm Jimmy Martinez. I was married to your daughter Maria. I'm looking for her and the kids." The woman's expression changed from caution to shock, then to something that looked like anger. "Jimmy Martinez," she said, her voice rising, "you have some nerve coming here after all these years." "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything," Jimmy said quickly. "I just wanted to see if they were okay and to apologize for what I put them through." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at George with curiosity, clearly wondering who this well-dressed man was and why he was with Jimmy. George stepped forward and extended his hand. "Ma'am, I'm George Strait. Jimmy and I served together in the army many years ago. I've been helping him get back on his feet." The recognition was immediate. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened, and she looked back and forth between George and Jimmy with confusion. "You're George Strait, the singer?" "Yes, ma'am. I found Jimmy a few months ago, and I've been helping him with his recovery. He's been sober for 9 months now, and is working steady. He's not the same man who left your daughter." Mrs. Rodriguez studied Jimmy's face carefully, taking in his healthy appearance and clear eyes. "Maria's not here," she said finally. "She remarried about 5 years ago. Good man, treats her well. They live across town now." The news hit Jimmy like a physical blow, though he tried not to show it. "I'm glad she found someone who could make her happy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What about the kids? Are they okay?" "They're both grown now," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her tone softening slightly. "Miguel is 28, works as a teacher. Sophia is 26, just finished nursing school. They're good kids, despite everything they went through." Jimmy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm proud of them. I always knew they'd make something of themselves." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at George again, then back at Jimmy. "Why are you here, Jimmy? What do you want?" "I just wanted to apologize," Jimmy said. "I wanted them to know that I'm sorry for abandoning them and that I'm trying to make amends for my mistakes. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed them to know that I never stopped loving them." The older woman was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her emotions. "You put my daughter and grandchildren through hell," she said finally. "Maria cried herself to sleep for months after you left. The kids kept asking where their daddy was, and she didn't know what to tell them." "I know," Jimmy said, his voice breaking. "I was sick and I was a coward. I thought they'd be better off without me. But I realize now that I was just running away from my problems." George watched the exchange with a heavy heart, understanding the pain on both sides. He had seen firsthand how Jimmy's addiction and mental health issues had destroyed his ability to function as a husband and father, but he had also witnessed his friend's genuine remorse and commitment to change. "Mrs. Rodriguez," George said gently, "I know this is difficult, but Jimmy has been working hard to get his life together. He's been going to counseling, he's been sober for 9 months, and he has a steady job now. He's not asking for anything except the chance to apologize and maybe let his children know that he's alive and trying to make things right." The woman looked at Jimmy for a long moment, then sighed. I'll talk to Maria. I'll tell her you came by and that you're doing better. But I won't make any promises about whether she'll want to see you." Jimmy nodded gratefully. "That's all I can ask for. Thank you." As they turned to leave, Mrs. Rodriguez called out, "Jimmy?" He turned back to face her. "I'm glad you're getting help," she said. "Despite everything, I never wanted you to end up on the streets. You were a good man once. Maybe you can be again." The drive back to the ranch was quiet. With Jimmy lost in his thoughts about the encounter, George could see that his friend was processing a mixture of emotions. Disappointment that he couldn't see his family immediately, but also relief that they were doing well. "At least they're okay," Jimmy said finally. "That's what matters most." "This is just the beginning," George said. "It might take time, but if you keep working on yourself and showing that you've changed, they might be willing to give you a chance." Over the following weeks, Jimmy threw himself into his work and his recovery with renewed determination. He attended every counseling session, participated actively in group therapy, and found solace in the routine of ranch life. Dr. Chen noticed the change in his attitude during their sessions. "You seem more at peace," she observed. "How are you feeling about the visit with your mother-in-law?" "It was hard," Jimmy admitted. "But I'm glad I did it. I needed to face the reality of what I'd done to my family. Now I can work on accepting it and moving forward." Meanwhile, George had been thinking about Jimmy's situation and the broader issue of veteran homelessness. His friend's story was just one of thousands, and he began to wonder what he could do to help others who were struggling with similar problems. The idea started small. George began visiting the area where he had found Jimmy, bringing sandwiches and water to the homeless veterans he encountered there. He didn't announce his presence or seek publicity. He simply wanted to help. Carlos, his driver, had become an unofficial partner in these efforts. "Mr. Strait," he said one evening as they prepared to head downtown, "I know some of these guys. They're not all veterans, but a lot of them are. They've got stories like Jimmy's." George nodded. "I figured as much. What do you think we should do?" "Well," Carlos said thoughtfully, "maybe we start by just listening to them. Find out what they need most." Over the next few weeks, George and Carlos made regular trips to the downtown area, talking with homeless individuals and learning about their situations. George was struck by the complexity of the problem. While some people were dealing with addiction and mental health issues like Jimmy, others were simply victims of economic circumstances or lack of affordable housing. One evening, they met a veteran named Robert, who had been living in his car for 6 months after losing his job at a manufacturing plant. Another was a woman named Patricia, who had been evicted from her apartment when she couldn't afford rent increases. "This is bigger than I thought," George told Jimmy that night. "There are so many people out there who just need a helping hand." Jimmy nodded. "I met a lot of good people when I was on the streets. Most of them aren't there by choice. Sometimes I felt like I was the only one who had brought it on himself." "That's not true," George said firmly. "You had a disease, Jimmy. Addiction is a disease, and so is PTSD. You didn't choose to be sick any more than someone chooses to have cancer." The conversation gave George an idea. He had been thinking about ways to help more veterans, and he realized that Jimmy's story and experience could be valuable in reaching others who were struggling. "What would you think about helping me with these visits?" George asked. "You understand what these people are going through better than I do." Jimmy was honored by the suggestion, but also nervous. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility, George. What if I say the wrong thing?" "You won't," George said confidently. "You'll say exactly what they need to hear because you've been where they are." After discussing it with Dr. Chen, who thought it would be beneficial for Jimmy's recovery to help others, Jimmy agreed to join George on his visits to the homeless community. The first trip was emotional for Jimmy, seeing the familiar faces and places where he had spent 3 years of his life, but it was also empowering. He found that he could connect with people in ways that George, despite his genuine compassion, simply couldn't. "You're Jimmy Martinez," said a veteran named Carlos who had known Jimmy from the streets. "Man, I heard you were doing better. Look at you." Jimmy spent an hour talking with Carlos about his recovery, the treatment program, and the job at the ranch. By the end of the conversation, Carlos had agreed to let Jimmy take him to the Healing Hearts Recovery Center for an assessment. "You did good tonight," George told Jimmy as they drove home. "You gave that man hope." "It felt good to help," Jimmy admitted. "I've been on the receiving end of generosity for so long. It's nice to be able to give something back." As word of George's efforts began to spread quietly through the community, more people started reaching out to offer help. Local businesses began donating food and supplies, and other veterans who had overcome homelessness volunteered to share their stories. What had started as a personal mission to help one friend was beginning to grow into something much larger, and it was about to capture the attention of the entire city in ways that none of them could have imagined. 3 weeks after their first visit to the homeless community together, Jimmy and George were preparing for another evening of outreach when Jimmy's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" Jimmy said hesitantly. "Dad, is this really you?" The voice on the other end was emotional, tentative. Jimmy nearly dropped the phone. "Miguel, is that you, son?" "Yes, it's me. Grandma Rodriguez told me you came by. She said you were doing better, that you were sober and working." Miguel's voice was a mixture of hope and caution. Jimmy's hands shook as he gripped the phone. "I am, son. I'm 9 months sober now, and I have a job. I'm living with an old army buddy who's been helping me get back on my feet." There was a long pause before Miguel spoke again. "I want to see you, Dad. I mean, if you want to see me." "Of course I want to see you," Jimmy said, tears streaming down his face. "I've wanted to see you every day for the past 6 years." They arranged to meet the next day at a small cafe in downtown San Antonio. Jimmy was nervous about the encounter, but George encouraged him to focus on listening and taking responsibility for his actions without making excuses. "Just be honest," George advised. "Tell him how you feel, acknowledge the pain you caused, and let him know how you're working to change." The next morning, Jimmy arrived at the cafe early, his hands trembling as he waited for his son. When Miguel walked through the door, Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. The boy he remembered was now a man, tall, with kind eyes and a strong jaw that reminded Jimmy of his own father. Miguel spotted his father immediately and approached the table cautiously. "Dad?" Jimmy stood up, unsure whether to hug his son or shake his hand. Miguel made the decision for him, stepping forward and embracing his father tightly. "I missed you so much," Miguel whispered, and Jimmy felt years of guilt and pain begin to lift from his shoulders. They talked for 3 hours, with Jimmy answering his son's questions honestly and directly. Miguel told him about finishing college, becoming a teacher, and meeting a wonderful woman named Elena, whom he planned to marry. "I want you to meet her," Miguel said, "and I want you to know that despite everything, I never stopped loving you. I was angry for a long time, but I understand now that you were sick." Jimmy was overwhelmed by his son's forgiveness and maturity. "I'm proud of the man you've become," he said. "I just wish I could have been there to see it happen." "You can be here now," Miguel said simply. "That's what matters." They made plans to meet again the following week, and Miguel promised to talk to his sister Sofia about seeing their father. As Jimmy drove back to the ranch, he felt lighter than he had in years. George was waiting for him with a knowing smile. "How did it go?" "Better than I ever dreamed," Jimmy said, his voice full of emotion. "He wants to see me again. He's going to talk to Sofia about meeting me too." "That's wonderful news," George said. "See, I told you that people can forgive when they see real change." That evening, as they prepared for their regular visit to the homeless community, Jimmy was filled with a new sense of purpose. His reunion with his son had reinforced his commitment to helping others who were struggling with similar problems. When they arrived downtown, they found an unexpected scene. A local news crew was interviewing some of the homeless veterans, and reporter Sarah Martinez was asking questions about recent efforts to provide assistance to the community. "We've been hearing about someone who's been coming down here regularly, bringing food and supplies," Sarah was saying to a veteran named Tom. "Can you tell us about that?" Tom nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, there's this guy who's been helping us out. Real nice fellow, doesn't make a big deal about it. He just shows up with sandwiches and water, talks to us like we're human beings." "Do you know who this person is?" Sarah asked. Tom glanced over and saw George and Jimmy approaching. "There he is now. That's the guy who's been helping us." Sarah turned to see George Strait walking toward them, and her eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Strait, you're the one who's been helping the homeless community?" George looked uncomfortable with the attention but nodded. "I've been doing what I can to help. We all have a responsibility to look out for each other." "How did you get involved with this cause?" Sarah asked, motioning for her cameraman to start recording. George glanced at Jimmy, who nodded encouragingly. "I found an old army buddy of mine living on the streets a few months ago. Helping him get back on his feet opened my eyes to the broader problem of veteran homelessness." Sarah's reporter instincts kicked in. "Would your friend be willing to talk to us about his experience?" Jimmy stepped forward. "I'm Jimmy Martinez. George and I served together in the army in the 1970s. I ended up homeless due to addiction and PTSD, and George found me and helped me get into recovery." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Jimmy sharing his story of addiction, homelessness, and recovery. George talked about the need for more resources and support for veterans, while several other homeless individuals shared their own experiences. When the story aired 2 days later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The local news station's phones rang constantly, with people wanting to know how they could help. Donations poured in, volunteers stepped forward, and other veterans shared their own stories of struggle and recovery. "George Strait's Homeless Veteran Friend, Inspiring Citywide Movement," read the headline in the San Antonio Express-News. The story detailed Jimmy's journey from homelessness to recovery and the growing grassroots effort to help other veterans in need. Dr. Chen called George the day after the story aired. "We've been flooded with calls from veterans wanting to get into treatment," she said. "We're going to need to expand our program." The local businesses began reaching out to offer jobs to veterans in recovery. The owner of a chain of auto repair shops called George directly, saying he had watched the story and wanted to hire veterans with mechanical skills like Jimmy. "This is exactly what we need," George told Jimmy as they read through the dozens of emails and messages they had received. "People want to help. They just needed to know how." Jimmy was amazed by the response. "I never thought my story would matter to anyone." "Your story matters because it shows that recovery is possible," George said. "People need to see that someone can come back from rock bottom." The following week, the mayor of San Antonio announced the formation of a new task force on veteran homelessness, with George serving as an honorary chair and Jimmy as a community advisor. The task force would work to coordinate resources, provide job training, and create affordable housing options for veterans in need. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning, George Strait stood before a crowd of over 500 people gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony of the Second Chance Ranch. The 200-acre facility would include transitional housing for 100 veterans, job training workshops, counseling offices, a medical clinic, and recreational facilities. Jimmy stood beside him, wearing a suit that George had insisted on buying for the occasion. In the audience were Miguel and Sophia, who had been gradually rebuilding their relationship with their father over the past few months. Sophia had even brought her fiancé, a fellow nurse named David, who had served in Afghanistan. 8 months ago, I found my friend Jimmy Martinez living on the streets of downtown San Antonio, George said to the assembled crowd. Today, he's not just my ranch manager and my friend, he's become one of the most effective advocates for veterans in this city. The applause was thunderous as Jimmy stepped forward to speak. I used to think that once you hit rock bottom, there was no way back up, he began, his voice steady and strong. But I learned that sometimes rock bottom is just the foundation for rebuilding your life. He talked about his journey from homelessness to recovery, the importance of having people who believed in him, and the responsibility that came with second chances. We're not just building a facility here today, he said. We're building hope. We're telling every veteran who's struggling that they matter, that their service meant something, and that they deserve a chance to rebuild their lives. The crowd included city officials, business leaders, veterans organizations, and dozens of formerly homeless veterans who had been helped by the programs that grew out of George and Jimmy's friendship. Many of them had found jobs, housing, and sobriety through the network of services that had developed over the past year. Tom Wilson, George's former ranch manager who had become Jimmy's mentor, was now the director of the job training program. Dr. Chen had been appointed as the clinical director of the facility. Even Carlos, George's driver, had taken a position as transportation coordinator, helping veterans get to appointments and job interviews. This all started with one act of kindness, George continued in his speech. I saw a friend in need, and I did what anyone should do. I helped. But what I learned is that when you help one person, you create ripples that spread far beyond what you can imagine. Those ripples had indeed spread far beyond San Antonio. The story of George Strait and Jimmy Martinez had been featured in national media, inspiring similar programs in other cities. Veterans organizations across the country had reached out for advice on replicating their model. The Country Music Association had even created a new award for humanitarian efforts, with George and Jimmy as the first recipients. But for both men, the real reward was seeing lives transformed. As the groundbreaking ceremony concluded, George found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. His farewell tour was set to begin in just 3 weeks, but he knew now that this wouldn't really be the end of his career. It would be the beginning of a new chapter focused on service rather than entertainment. Jimmy had become more than just a ranch manager or even a friend. He had become a partner in creating something meaningful and lasting. Their weekly visits to the homeless community had evolved into a comprehensive outreach program, staffed by volunteers and formerly homeless veterans who understood the challenges firsthand. That evening, the extended family gathered at George's ranch for a celebration dinner. Jimmy's children were there, along with Sophia's fiancé and Miguel's girlfriend, Elena. Norma had prepared a feast, and the conversation was filled with laughter and stories about the journey they had all taken together. Dad, Sophia said as the evening wound down, I want you to know how proud I am of you, not just for getting sober, but for what you're doing to help other people. Jimmy's eyes filled with tears. I wasted so many years, honey. I can't get that time back, but I can make sure it wasn't all for nothing. You didn't waste those years, Miguel said. You learned from them, and now you're using what you learned to help other people. That's not waste, that's wisdom. As the family said their goodbyes and headed home, George and Jimmy found themselves alone on the porch once again, the place where so many of their important conversations had taken place. Hard to believe it's only been 8 months since I found you downtown, George said. Jimmy shook his head in amazement. Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming. I went from having nothing and no one to having a job, a home, my kids back in my life, and the chance to help other veterans. It doesn't seem real. It's real, George assured him. And it's just the beginning. The ranch will help thousands of veterans over the years, but more importantly, it will show other communities what's possible when people come together to solve problems. Jimmy nodded, then grew quiet for a moment. George, I need to ask you something. Why did you do it? I mean, really, why? You could have just given me some money and walked away, but you changed your whole life to help me. George considered the question carefully. You know, I've thought about that a lot. I think it's because when I saw you that night, I didn't see a homeless veteran or a stranger in need. I saw my brother. I saw someone who had served his country and fallen through the cracks, and I couldn't walk away from that. He paused, looking out over the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under the stars, but I also think it reminded me of why I got into music in the first place. It wasn't for fame or money. It was to connect with people, to tell stories that mattered. Helping you, helping all these veterans, it feels like the most important story I've ever been part of. Jimmy understood. You gave me back my life, George. I'll never be able to repay that. You don't need to repay it, George replied. You just need to keep paying it forward. Every veteran you help, every family that gets reunited, every person who gets a second chance, that's how you repay it. As winter turned to spring, the Second Chance Ranch began accepting its first residents. The facility was a model of efficiency and compassion, with comfortable housing units, state-of-the-art job training facilities, and a clinical program that addressed both addiction and mental health issues. Jimmy had been promoted to overall program director, a role that combined his personal experience with administrative skills he had developed over the past year. He loved the work, finding deep satisfaction in helping other veterans navigate the path from homelessness to stability. George's farewell tour had been a massive success, selling out arenas across the country and raising additional funds for veteran programs, but he found himself eager to finish so he could focus full-time on the foundation work. The last concert was scheduled for December 31st at the Alamodome in San Antonio, a fitting end to his performing career in the city where his new mission had begun. Jimmy and his family would be in the audience, along with dozens of veterans who had been helped by their programs. On the morning of the final concert, George and Jimmy made one last visit to the downtown area where their story had begun. The homeless population had decreased significantly over the past year, with many people finding housing and services through the various programs that had been established. They stopped at the exact spot where George had found Jimmy 8 months earlier. A small plaque had been placed there by the city, marking it as the birthplace of the San Antonio Veterans Initiative. It's hard to believe this all started right here, Jimmy said, touching the plaque. The best journeys always start with a single step, George replied. We just had no idea where that step would lead. As they walked back to the truck, they passed several veterans who recognized them and stopped to say hello. Each one had a story of recovery, of second chances, of lives rebuilt with dignity and purpose. That night, as George took the stage at the Alamodome for the final time, he looked out at the crowd and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had entertained millions of people over his career, but the work he had done with Jimmy felt like his greatest accomplishment. Tonight marks the end of my touring career, he told the crowd. But it's also the beginning of a new chapter focused on serving our veterans. 8 months ago, I found an old army buddy living on the streets. Tonight, he's sitting in the front row with his children, helping to run the largest veteran assistance program in Texas. The spotlight found Jimmy in the audience, and the crowd erupted in applause. Jimmy stood and waved, his eyes shining with tears and pride. We've learned that no one is beyond help, no one is too far gone to come back, and no problem is too big when people come together to solve it, George continued. The Second Chance Ranch will continue this work long after I'm gone, and I hope it inspires other communities to take care of their own. As George played his final song, Amarillo Morning, Jimmy reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A year ago, he had been sleeping on the streets, convinced that his life was over. Tonight, he was surrounded by family and friends, with meaningful work and a bright future ahead. The song ended, and George took his final bow as a touring performer. But as he left the stage and embraced his friend Jimmy, both men knew that their most important work was just beginning. The Second Chance Ranch would go on to help over 10,000 veterans in its first 5 years, with a success rate of over 85% for those who completed the program. The model would be replicated in dozens of cities across the country, creating a network of support for veterans that hadn't existed before. But perhaps most importantly, the story of George Strait and Jimmy Martinez became a reminder that ordinary acts of kindness could create extraordinary change. It showed that success wasn't measured just in albums sold or awards won, but in lives transformed and communities strengthened. Years later, when people asked George about his greatest accomplishment, he wouldn't talk about his music career or his Hall of Fame induction. He would tell them about a friend he found on the streets and the movement they built together, a movement that proved that in America, there really could be second chances for everyone. The friendship that began in the army and was renewed on the streets of San Antonio had become something much larger than either man could have imagined. It had become a legacy of hope, a testament to the power of compassion, and proof that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to walk away when someone needs help. And in the end, that made all the difference.